There is no one original tale when it comes to Disney's Sleeping Beauty. The art is inspired by 14th century European tapestries. The music is adapted from Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty ballet, and the story is based on the Perrault and Grimm versions of the fairy tale, but with so many changes and new scenes that it's actually very difficult to compare to either of those stories outside of the beginning cursing scene. But when someone talks about how the original tale will ruin this movie for you, they're not actually referring to any of the versions that this story is based on. Instead, they're typically talking about Perseforest or Sun, Moon, and Talia, in which the Sleeping Beauty character is impregnated while she's still asleep. Something that you might be shocked to learn doesn't happen in this film, or even the stories that it's based on. In fact, this story is actually so different from either of those that the one and only similarity between this film and Sun, Moon, and Talia is that she falls asleep from pricking her finger on a spindle. Why it happens, how it happens, what happens afterwards, all completely 1000% different. Fairy tales, like many types of oral storytelling traditions, often change over time and place. And we're talking about stories from all over Europe in different centuries and decades. There are likely many other older versions than the oldest one that we have written down. And it's weird to act like this film is somehow beholden to any version of Sleeping Beauty, or even the ones that it actually is based on. Sure, it can be interesting to bring them up and discuss how we got here, but if the filmmakers created a prophetic dream or any other interpretive element, how does it fall apart just because it isn't in a different version of the story? She doesn't meet her prince before being put to sleep in almost any version of the story besides this one. She also doesn't grow up thinking that she's a peasant girl living in a cottage with her aunts. Do those story beats just not exist in this film, even though we can literally see them on screen just because they didn't in earlier versions? I just think it's always silly when people try to bring up the original fairy tales to try and talk about how horrible this story is, because that's just not how stories work. And it's especially silly when they do it for stories that are millennia old, because even though I also hate when people do this with The Little Mermaid, at least that story does in fact have an original tale. A man wrote that story. But something like Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Cinderella, Rapunzel, like, come on. There is no original. Even the oldest version written down is just the oldest that has survived. And when trying to understand a film's themes, symbolism, and depth, especially one with an amalgamation of sources the way that this Sleeping Beauty has, we can't just pretend like themes and story elements don't exist just because a different version doesn't have them. Let me be clear, that goes for much more than this film or even Disney in general. Where a piece of art comes from and how we got here is important to discuss, but it should not completely overtake that piece of art itself.